presentation is not to give financial product advice. If any product advice is given in the presentation, the standard disclaimers that this is general advice only apply. That is, it has been prepared without taking into account any personal objectives, financial situation or needs, and therefore you should consider the appropriateness of the advice in light of your own situation and requirements. Now, we are very fortunate to have two ASX-listed biotech CEOs on the panel today, Dr. Megan Baldwin and Mr. Gary Phillips, who will be providing some of their insights into commercialising a biotech company and answering your questions. So please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen anytime from now, and we'll address as many of those as possible after we hear from the panellists. But first, Matt on the horizon, where I comment on some of the important developments impacting our sector and thus investment objectives. In no particular order, Cogstate says Tokyo's Eisai Co will pay $15 million US upfront and at least $30 million US in royalties for a global license to its digital cognitive assessment technology. Antisense says the US FDA has granted orphan drug designation for ATL 1102 for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. IBM with Pfizer has developed an artificial intelligence model that could eventually predict if a person will develop Alzheimer's disease using a simple language test. That's one to keep an eye out for. And as most of the audience will know, Biotech and Invest 2020, Australia's largest life science conference, will be delivered online, live, 28th, what's that, tomorrow, to the 30th of October. Microbio, a private company, announced a rapid COVID test that can distinguish between replicating/infectious and non-replicating SARS-CoV-2. PYC, formerly Philogica, says the US FDA has requested further data in response to the company's orphan drug designation request for BP001 for retinitis pigmentosa. ResApp has built an application to monitor patients' coughs over an extended period of time, which has been licensed to AstraZeneca subsidiary for use in a clinical trial for lung cancer. Don't know the metrics there as far as dollars. And here's a challenging one for those in the USA. At least 4 US firms have begun class actions against Mesoblast, claiming the company failed to inform investors of the risk of graft versus host disease success. All 4 firms make similar claims that Mesoblast made materially false and or misleading statements, as well as failed to disclose material adverse facts about the company's business operations and prospects. Tough environment. Finally, Wexford Hayes' latest remuneration report says the average total CEO remuneration in Australia on the ASX is $906,000 per annum, 2.1 million per annum for market caps above $1 billion, 1 million per annum for market caps between 100 million and $1 billion, and 540K per annum for market caps less than 100 million. Now, we turn to our panel members. Megan and Gary, you have both had a lot of experience and success in the biotech sector. For the benefit of the audience, would you mind imparting some of your knowledge on the following questions? Can I start with you, Gary?
Sure.
Gary, Pharmexis has one FDA-approved product, Aridol, and you are awaiting a second FDA approval for Bronchitol, if I'm correct. Congratulations also on your successful FDA application for orphan drug designation. And you also recently obtained permission from the FDA for a phase 1/2 clinical trial for your pan-LOX inhibitor in myelofibrosis. So that's a fair bit of experience there. Tell us about the processes dealing with the FDA for both, and who in the team were involved, and whether you used external advisors, what were the biggest roadblocks, and how did you handle them?
Okay, thanks, Matt. So I'll sort of break that up into thinking about the IND first, the investigational new drug application, and then the NDA afterwards. I think with INDs, it's it's a relatively quick process, so it's only 30 days from application to when you get feedback from the FDA. So you can be lulled into a false sense of security. This is quite a simple, quick process, but actually there's a lot of strategy that goes into thinking about when to put an IND in and what questions to ask. So I think you need to know what questions do you need answers to in order to carry on the development of your drug. And for that, do you have enough data for the agency to give you a meaningful answer? It's very easy to ask questions, but if you haven't got the data to back it up, then very often the agency will give you a shrug of the shoulders, metaphorically, and we don't know. You've also got to have a good understanding, I think, of the questions that you don't want an answer to. So, you don't want to go in and ask a question which puts you potentially at risk of a clinical hold because you haven't got quite enough data yet. So, clinical holds are materially, it's an announceable event, so you don't really want to be doing that. So there's a lot of strategy. You do get the chance for a pre-IND as well. So there's an opportunity to kind of go in and ask some preliminary questions to suss the ground out before you go with a full IND. Timing is important. So do you go in at the end of your preclinical phase or after you've done some human studies in phase 1? So a good example would be that drug that we've just got an IND approval for. It's we designate it 5505, and that's for the orphan bone cancer myelofibrosis. So this is a potentially disease-modifying mechanism of action in this drug, and it's going into a market that's worth, well, the annual sales of drugs are approaching $1 billion per year for a standard of care that is largely just symptomatic at the moment. So there's a lot of room to maneuver in that, and the market caps of companies with positive phase 2 data also is quite eye-watering. So we've had a really fast development time on that drug. It's phase 2 ready now after only 2 years after we filed the patent. We've completed long-term tox, so the phase 2 study is able to be powered to show efficacy and safety. So, we had plenty of experience with related small molecule drugs with similar chemistry. So we identified early on that the long-term tox was really our only limitation for going into the clinic to do an efficacy study. So answers from the FDA at the end of the preclinical testing with only 1 month or 3 month tox wouldn't have added an awful lot of value for us. So we decided to wait until we had the 6 month tox before we went in with our IND, we did the phase 1 in Australia. Even then, I mean, the IND application, it takes a month. There were 20,000 pages in it, so it involved a team of people from drug discovery, medical, regulatory, CMC, so you've got to put a lot of information about the drug substance as well and how you're manufacturing it, plus external advisors. I guess external advisors were essential if you don't have FDA experience in your team, which most Australian biotechs don't. And they helped us with which questions to ask, what content to provide, and also how to respond to the FDA questions that you get during the process. So you haven't got long, so you've got to go back in quickly with that. So IND quick, but an important step forward for us as a company to get approval to go there, and everybody takes notice of that. From an NDA perspective, Aridol was the first, and now we're waiting for Bronchitol. Both have had their challenges. The NDA is a huge body of work. If the IND is large, the NDA is massive, irrespective of whether it's a diagnostic, an orphan treatment, or a mainstream product. We built a lot of in-house experience at Pharmaxis, but of course you need an awful lot of external help as well. This is definitely a one-time job for most biotechs. You don't have a stream of these things coming through. So you don't want to be carrying that experience on your team and the cost of it all the time. So it's certainly one that you buy in a lot of external help. We also went through 2 advisory panel meetings. Mesoblast have just gone through one. We've gone through 2 of them. They're a whole seminar in their own right. Getting the right external advisors for that is absolutely key. We contracted a company which had, this was the only thing they did, was just help companies through advisory panel meetings, and you wouldn't expect much change from $1 million to get through it, just for their help and preparing for it and everything else that goes with it. A really carefully choreographed team effort to cope with the panel. Timing for that is all about choice of the CRO that you're using for the phase 3, the pivotal you're going to put in, metrics around the production of the clinical study reports. So it's a huge exercise. You need a very good project manager to make you through it. Bronchitol we're waiting for now. So the advisory committee voted to recommend it last year. The FDA response letter we had in June of last year stated we needed to do one more bit of data collection on testing some of the instructions we were giving to healthcare professionals for the tolerance test that's used for the product. And the FDA have set a goal action date of November the 1st, which actually is only a few days away now. So it's really, really close. The US is about 2/3 of the global CF market by value. So I can't understate how important that decision is for the company, which is just around the corner. So yeah, I hope that gives you a pretty good run through of some of the processes we use anyway.
Well, it just goes to show how complicated and how much effort's gone into it and how much experience your company has in this area. So given your experience and for the benefit of other executives in the audience, what learnings and advice would you give others who aim to submit to the FDA?
I think it probably doesn't need saying, but first emphasizing, don't underestimate the amount of work that you need to do to submit an IND, let alone an NDA. It's not something that you go into lightly. It's a process. The FDA are a huge organization, and because of that and the amount of, imagine the amount of submissions they get of all different kinds of diagnostics, medications and everything else. They work to a very strict timeline, and it's not them that bends, it's you. So you have to be ready to be flexible. You have to be ready to move fast and answer their questions when they come up. Do get advice early, I think, is another one. So make sure your internal processes align with the challenge ahead. One of the things, for example, we learned with the IND is that you can save an awful lot of effort when you go in for your IND if actually you've structured the investigator brochure, which most companies would have for a new drug, in a way that the FDA structure, so that you don't have to rewrite the whole thing. So there are things that you can do to prepare for it and help yourself. So even if it's relatively early on, I think, and you're thinking about it in the future, it doesn't hurt to get advice early about how you prepare for it to help yourself. Building a good relationship. We had the same head of the respiratory function in the FDA throughout maybe 8 years of us negotiating with the FDA over Bronchitol. So our relationship with that one person and the impact he had within his organization was critical. So you don't want to leave that in the hands of external advisors. It's something that you as a company yourself should control and try and put your best foot forward on. And I think lastly, everything is in the public domain at some point with the FDA. So managing that negotiation with the FDA whilst managing the disclosure issues that you have as a publicly listed company are challenging. They're ever present, and you do need to manage them and be aware of them before you go in.
That's a really good point. Now, Megan, congratulations. So on raising $128 million US. I believe that's the largest raise ever by an ASX listed company, Biotech. Given you're now dual listed on ASX and NASDAQ, I know you can't comment beyond the information that's in the public domain and in the registration statement. So please advise if any question of mine is out of line or even from the audience. So for the benefit of the other executives listening, can you take us through the process when the company first decided on NASDAQ strategy, what was involved preparing for the raise and dual listing, who was involved internally and external advisors?
Sure, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'm happy to sort of elaborate on that. And good to be at this point to be dual listed after quite a long journey to get to this point as well. So I think in terms of your first part of that question with respect to when did we first decide on a NASDAQ strategy, I guess the seed was kind of planted many, many years ago I think many people on the call and yourself would be aware that we've had a strong institutional shareholder base for a long time, for many years now. Right now, over 80% of our shares on issue are owned by institutions. And that, as I said, has been the case for some time. Those healthcare investors saw the potential of our asset. Obviously, they invested early and they've continued to support the company as we've advanced through early stage clinical development. And now as we prepare for our phase 3 and final, hopefully the final phase of clinical development before commercialisation. So we've had a long history of good, strong institutional support. And whilst that strong support has been there, it's been very clear, I think, for many years that many US investors are either unable or they may be indeed unwilling to invest on the ASX or less willing to invest on the ASX. And that generally a number of healthcare international sophisticated institutions, rightly or wrongly, would prefer to invest in a NASDAQ listed company. And that was really a message that we heard on the road for many, many years leading up to sort of the current events with our undertaking the listing just recently. So we really listened to our current shareholders. We listened to new investors that we were meeting with. I think many of those investors saw the attractiveness and the familiarity of a company being on the NASDAQ. They could see the potential for greater liquidity, the benefits of accessing the US capital markets, and the potential really to realise valuations and being benchmarked against a different set of US listed companies was certainly attractive. And so for many years, I think the potential for the company to list on the NASDAQ was something that we had discussed with our shareholder base and with investors in a hypothetical sense. But we also considered very seriously at the board level as well. And for many months and years, it was always a matter of, well, when is the optimal timing? As you know, we read out our phase 2B wet AMD clinical trial towards the end of last year. That really set us on a path of wanting to be able to fully fund our clinical development program through the final stages of phase 3 pivotal trials. And we remain very confident in the data that we've generated, such that the kind of financing that we require to take it through that next step we see as an essential step. And one that we really are justified in undertaking in order to take it through to that approval and commercialisation process. So on the readout of the phase 2B trial data, we really did immediately start taking steps to ensure that we were in a position to move the program forward. And that's really where we've ended up at this point now in a strong cash position to be able to do that and to be able to move it forward independently and read out our data. The next part of your question was really in relation to what is involved. And I think I can kind of reiterate what Gary said in many regards with respect to, the formal process may appear to be quite short, when you're interacting with the FDA and NASDAQ listing is not dissimilar, but there are many, many months of preparatory work that go into being ready to list on the NASDAQ. It's a very long process. It involves implementing appropriate internal controls, financial reporting standards that fulfill the requirements and the standards of the SEC in the US. It frequently will involve a re-auditing of financial statements or auditing at least of your financial statements to PCAOB standards that fulfill the criteria for the listing. And there's a lot of time and engagement of external advisors that has to go along with that. A US auditing team, for example, you need to engage with your investors to ensure that they're on board. You need to have identified, the banks that will be involved in the syndicate. You need to have established those relationships and bring in advisors. Most notably, really critical to the process is your US and Australian legal counsel, who, if they're the right people on your team, really are in a position to really guide the company to ensure that you're doing everything that you need to do and that you're executing it successfully. But not only that, there's the interactions with underwriters councils, both on the US and the Australian side as well. There's all of the time that needs to be invested in the preparation of the registration statement itself. That's a process that takes many, many weeks, if not months, of drafting, review, redrafting by multiple parties, of diligence that goes into ensuring that every statement that is made is well backed up and validated with either data or published reports. Every single word that is effectively in that statement needs to be backed up, and that does really take a long time, and that's all done in the background before the document is even filed with the SEC. And it's literally a process that can take 6 months, if not longer. And so you really do need the right internal team, but the right external advisors to have come in to support the company as well. In terms of who was involved in that internally, obviously there's a big role to play by the CEO. There was a lot of hands-on work by myself, but I was very well supported by my CFO and company secretary as well. And a lot of the information that needs to be pulled together does relate to financial reporting. And I was really, really pleased to know that my CFO was very capable and very much on top of all of those aspects as well. So going hand in hand, the CEO and the CFO together with the external advisors is really how the job can get done. And so that's really how we got to be in the situation where we are now a dual listed company, really on the back of a long-term plan, but really founded on the basis of wanting to ensure the company is independently funded, in a strong position to move into late-stage clinical development.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, but it's a fantastic effort, and I think even though we know it's a lot of hard work, just to hear you say that, I think we probably should double what we expect, a bit like the biotech rule, twice as long, twice as much. And so, Megan, for the benefit of others in the audience, what learnings advice can you give others who aim to access the US capital markets?
Oh, not dissimilar to what Gary said, which is, be prepared and get ready early. I think it's if you do it right, and I think, we all learn along the way as well, but you can never be too prepared. It's a process that can take many, many years, really, in order to build your register out. You'll be well placed to try to attract the right investors to your register sooner rather than later. You want those investors to be supportive for the long run, and you want them to be the right kind of investors that can support you as you kind of move forward in development, and the capital requirements actually increase over time as well. So I think building the right register is such a critical piece of the equation, and that's a learning that I think everyone that we all aim for as biotech CEOs, but it is such a critical element of success. The other thing is, even if investors are not have not yet invested in your company, but ensuring that you have those networks in place and that there's a relationship there. Investors want to understand the company, they want to understand that you're executing on what you're saying that you're going to do. They want to know that you're credible, and that you hit the milestones that you're seeking to hit. And that's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something that happens over a 4 or 5 day roadshow. The other things I would say in terms of, learnings, advice is, build out your executive management team early, have that structure in place, have the right people at the table, and build out your board. I think US investors, international investors want to see there's some international flavour to your board as well. And I think that's also something that they view as attractive. And I think a lot of things can be undertaken quite early in the process and set you on the right path for a successful listing.
Thanks, Megan. The comment there that really sort of brought home to me was build out the right register. With all due respect to most other biotech companies, if someone's willing to invest, we're very grateful. So I presume that means you have to have the courage of your convictions and turn away certain investors if you don't think they're going to add value or be destructive. So it's a good effort. I wanted to ask you one more question. Can you take us through what was involved in selecting the US bankers, I think it was Citigroup and SVB, and why you had two, and how was the number 128 million US dollars decided upon?
Yeah, so when you do a US listing, you typically have a syndicate of banks. It's not that you work in isolation with only one bank. And I think one of the big misconceptions out there with that kind of structure, which is the standard structure for companies that list on the NASDAQ, is that it's not a duplication of fees. There's one bucket of fees and it's up amongst the banks that participate in the syndicate. As you said, we worked as book runners with both Citigroup as well as SVB Leerink, and there were also two additional co-managers on the deal as well, which were Truist as well as Oppenheimer. And they all have a role to play. I guess in execution of the deal, it's predominantly with the book runners of Citigroup and Leerink. But the decision to work with those two banks, again, comes from a relationship which is, again, built over a period of time. Both of those banks identified the potential of the company very early on. They were engaged in the company, had hosted roadshows for the company in both US as well as in Europe, which is, again, very important to establishing the network of investors and encouraging people to become engaged in the technology and the story. And so, you know, it's something that is built over months and sometimes years. And we rounded out that deep relationship with both Leerink and Citigroup by bringing in the lead managers at Truist and Truist Securities and Oppenheimer as well. Now, a syndicate of 3 to 4 banks is pretty standard. And so, you know, that's what we set to undertake as well. One of the advantages of being involved with more than just one bank, which is pretty typical in Australia, but one of the advantages is that a key point in, I guess, in selection is having an understanding of their analyst coverage and what the coverage universe is of that analyst and whether or not they're in a good position to understand the company's technology, and the interaction you have on that analyst side of the bank is equally as important as the interaction that you have on the banking side. And of course, there's that Chinese wall between the two, but as the company, you want to make sure that there's, you know, analysts that understand the space and understand your particular technology as well. So it goes hand in hand with the decision to work on the banking side as well. In terms of the quantum that we raised, as I said, the objective for the company was to fund through to top line data readout. That's obviously a incredibly value inflection point for the company. It's what the FDA and the EMA have commented would be sufficient for marketing authorization applications, so for approval. And we really wanted to set the company up to be funded through that milestone point. And so we set to, you know, raise of the order of around 128 odd million. And we issued the intended number of ADSs, and the final amount that was raised was really a reflection of the pricing, which was determined by the closing price the date before we listed on the NASDAQ. So you're kind of at the whim of a number of different factors. One is the closing price of the share price, the dynamics of the deal, but really ensuring that the raise that you're looking to get through gets you through to the milestones that you've described in your F1 statement, and really that enables you to meet your objectives. And I'm pleased to say that we hit that, and we're well placed to now execute on our phase 3 plans.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to take questions from the audience. So by all means, use your Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have had many questions, so apologies if we do not get to yours. The first question I've got here is from Graham. Interested in Megan's thoughts on dilution to get US exposure as others have failed.
Well, I think if you want to fund a program through to a meaningful point, and it does require, you know, significant capital, whether you raise that capital in the US or whether you raise that capital in Australia, there will be dilution, and obviously the value that comes back to shareholders is the investment that comes back into the program through that process. I think the important thing for us in accessing the US capital markets is that, you know, with a phase 3 late stage clinical program, that enables us to access a number of US investors that are long-term supportive investors that are based in the United States that otherwise wouldn't be able to invest on the ASX. And when you get to these later stage phases of a program, you really do need to be thinking about the long term and how you actually raise that kind of amount that is required to get you to your objective. And I think we've removed the financing overhang, and we've done it with really good, high quality investors that have come in.
Well done. Okay. Another one from Russell. Could Megan explain the difference between Australian and US Opthea share prices?
Yeah, so there is actually, when you do the conversion, they're at parity. There is for every ADS, it's an 8-to-1 ratio. So if you look at where we're trading now, $13.50 for an ADS, to $2.30, $2.40 on the Australian Stock Exchange. If you take into account the 8-to-1 ratio as well as the exchange rate, there's actually parity between the share prices, and we would expect them to track, perhaps not exactly, but pretty similarly. That's how the NASDAQ and the ASX, the interplay tends to work.
Okay, I must admit, I think you've read the question correctly. I was thinking he might be saying, why is there a 1% difference? And for, you know, currency exchange rates, imperfect markets, and an arbitrage opportunity that can, you know, people can often trade on them. But yeah, it's the 8-to-1 would be, I hope, is the main answer.
It's the exchange rate and the 8-to-1. Exactly.
Yeah. From Peter, what biotech companies have been successful in the last 10 years, both share price wise and company success? I might just have a crack at this, because last week we had Graham Wold and Scott Power on, and a similar question was asked, and the answer then was the companies that those gentlemen offered up then were Nanosonics, Avita Medical, Clinuvel, Polynovo, and Viralytics. And then they went on to say that others had done well, but then had fallen, like Rezap and Acrux and Impedimed. So, I mean, I can throw to Megan and Gary. Any other companies come to mind? Not to worry. Yeah.
I think you've captured
Which might be a part.
there, haven't you? And you've captured those that have done very well in terms of growth of the company, also those that have done, you know, quite attractive deals as well. So I think you probably captured a lot of overlap in what my thoughts would be as well.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's a relatively short list might be part of the reason for the question, and why it makes success very very special.
Well, I think, Matt, as well, our business is a long game. So you know, you can look at our history. You don't make an overnight success here, and sometimes you have slow burns. We've got many US companies that were worth absolutely nothing for 10, 15 years, and all of a sudden they pop up and they're now over $1 billion. So it's about timing as an investor, I think, sometimes, and picking the right runner. Yeah.
Next question is from Ross. How important is it to have the majority of headcount and operations domiciled in the US, noting that Mesoblast have around 2/3 of their personnel in the US? Either of you want to take that one?
Well, I can maybe have a stab. I mean, I was just before I start, so I was looking for something to prop my iPad up on before I came into this thing, and I picked out my cupboard. I don't think you can see this document. So this is the US offering from Pharmaxis from 2005. So just when Megan says it's a lot of work, it's it's a chunk. You know, we went through sort of a process, and we never had anybody domiciled in the US. But we found at that point that we had such a supportive Australian market that that we didn't need the US as much. And I remember Alan Robertson doing roadshows. He nearly killed himself running around the US trying to get people investing and stuff. And we never got the volumes on NASDAQ. So in the end, we withdrew from our dual listing back in sort of 2008, I think. So yeah, I think from our point of view, you've got to have the people where they're going to add value. And if you'd had volume in the US, then I think you need people there to talk to the people on the ground. I think that would be important. Maybe less so in the COVID world. I don't know. Maybe you can do it all, but Megan can do it all by Zoom in the middle of the night, and she'd just become a vampire, maybe.
I feel like I'm halfway there, Gary. I do think it's a company by company decision. It's not one rule fits all. I really think it depends on what activities you've got going on and where you're best to place your people. We're about to embark on a global clinical trial. There's definitely an argument to say that the proximity to many of our clinical trial sites will be important, just for being able to visit the sites, having the profile in the US, being able to kind of skip between Europe and the US might be easier. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule as to what the proportion of your staff need to be there at all. I think Gary's made a really good point. It really depends also on your register. And I think there is an expectation that if you're listed on the NASDAQ and you've got a lot of institutional US investors, that they want to see you. They want to see you frequently. They want to touch base with the company. And in that respect, you can either do the runaround, as Gary said, and be on the ground, which nowadays is on Zoom. But, in a world where everyone's traveling, there's an expectation you're going to be present in the US. And I think we'll get back to that, but it really depends on where your shareholders are, what the expectations are, what you're doing, and also where the talent is. And we've got a great team here in Melbourne, but there's also other talented people that we would like to have involved in our studies as well that may well be placed in the US. And that's something we'll just continue to discuss and decide on as we move forward.
So, and that's quite a nice segue to the last question, that how did COVID-19 affect the NASDAQ listing and capital raise, if at all? The question says, were you able or required to travel? Maybe you want to share why Gary calls you a vampire.
Well, there was no travel, and obviously we didn't want to be stuck in quarantine either here in Australia or in. And it's a good question, because I remember asking our banks involved in the deal, is it just that I'm Australian and doing all of this by Zoom, or is it that essentially every US company that's on the road looking to list is also doing it by Zoom? And the very clear, resounding response I got was that everyone was pretty much in the same playing field. Everyone was doing it via Zoom, doing it of course, if you're based in the US, you're doing it on the same time zone. But there was just an expectation that investors are not necessarily in their office, and there was not an expectation of going from one state to another. It was basically all done through a process of presentations over Zoom and all throughout the night. I think we started our conversation today, Matt, with me telling you that I just still do feel a little bit jet lagged, which is kind of weird to be jet lagged and I'm in Australia, but that is actually the case. But it worked out, it did work out reasonably well, as challenging as it was. And in many regards, it was said to me that it does actually put, the expectation is that Australians are always the ones that have to spend 2 or 3 days getting to and from international travel. Everyone was in the same position for once. Everyone had to do it via the same kind of platform. And maybe that leveled out the playing field a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. So in a fortnight, on the 10th of November, we plan to discuss the ASX biotech market and different strategies for us to penetrate major medical product markets and the risks of clinical trials and how they can be mitigated. So I want to thank the audience for your feedback, suggestions and questions. Most welcome. If you feel you can improve or have a suggestion for content, please don't hesitate to email me at matt@horizon3biotech.com. That's the number 3. Thanks go to FB Rice and Monsoon Communications for sponsoring and hosting this webinar. And finally, thank you to both of our panelists, Dr. Megan Baldwin and Mr. Gary Phillips. see you all again at the same time in a fortnight. Stay safe.
Thanks, Matt.
Yes. Okay. Bye-bye.